You're watching the Author Series, a production of New York University's Journal of Intellectual Property and Entertainment Law. In this episode, we're joined by Professor Sam Halabi from Georgetown Law. Professor Halabi has authored a new piece as part of the latest edition of JIPEL. It's titled Trademarks, Trade Dress, and the Patient Costs of Pharmaceutical Branding. In this piece, Professor Halabi challenges us to look past the confines of patent law. Instead, he looks to the effects of trade dress on pharmaceutical consumption. While patent protections last a relatively short amount of time, trade dress stretches on far longer. This prevents manufacturers of generic medications from creating pills that match the appearance of their brand name competitors. Predictably, this leads to confusion for the consumer. The same patient may go to the same pharmacy each month and receive the same medication, yet that medication may have an entirely different appearance from the previous month. This can lead to confusion, distrust, and even avoidance of medication. Now let's turn to Professor Halabi and see what he has to say on the topic. All right, we are here with Professor Sam Halabi from the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health at Georgetown Law to discuss his note, Trademarks, Trade Dress, and the Patient Costs of Pharmaceutical Branding. Professor Halabi, could you tell the audience a little bit about your background?
Yeah, you bet. So I'm a law professor. I tend to focus on intellectual property protections for biomedical innovations. This particular article is about sort of everyday prescription drugs. The article is really focused on those in capsule form, but sort of starts to reach into some sort of newer kinds of drugs that are taken through other modalities. And we tend to think of the protections for those kinds of biomedical innovations in terms of patents, sometimes regulatory exclusivities, or what the FDA says is your exclusive right to market a given medicine after it's been approved. And this one goes into an angle of intellectual property protection that hasn't been explored a great deal. So trademarks, which are potentially sort of indefinite. But I think that's probably enough just for introductory purposes.
Right. And so your article focuses on that distinction between patent laws and trade dress laws. Could you describe the basic differences for someone unfamiliar with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the patent is in many ways kind of the basic intellectual property protection form for all medicines. It includes vaccines, includes what are known as biologics, and that provides any inventor a 20-year protection as long as you meet criteria for novelty, non-obviousness, and utility, right? So that it can be of practical use, and they are extraordinarily important. Right, there are lots of very, sort of loud and public controversies about whether or not people should deserve 20 years of protection, but it represents a bargain, right? In exchange for the 20-year exclusivity, the inventor discloses the entirety of the innovation, so that sort of like the body of science can grow, and others can use the innovation. And when they use that particular invention, that they will typically pay the inventor or the patent right holder for the ability to do so. But there is this 20-year limit to them, right? And nobody really disputes that, although it's expanded over time. This article looks at trademark and trade dress. Trademark and trade dress are almost entirely statutory protections for how your product or your invention, as the case may be, appears, right? So it can be its color, hue, tone. In some jurisdictions like the United States, it includes sound or smell. And trade dress refers specifically to sort of product packaging, or what you might think of as sort of three-dimensional aspects of product appearance, and that is potentially indefinite. And so the article is concerned about this point in time where the patent sort of protection or other regulatory exclusivities drop off. And then theoretically, generic competitors or those who can afford to copy medicines more cheaply, which we want, right? Cheaper medicines, sort of when meds are cheaper, patients take their meds, right? It's an important part of just a public health system. They enter the market. But with respect to trade dress and trademark, they can't enter the market as to those products appearance, which means that in some ways the protection for the medicines is indefinite. You don't have to do very much to retain your trademark and trade dress protections. And so the article is concerned that even in a world where we make patent terms shorter, or even in a world where we start to make drugs more affordable in lots of supply and demand ways, as long as innovator firms are allowed to retain the rights to exclude others as to the appearance of their medicines, they'll remain expensive.
That's very interesting. Now, how did you go to explore this issue? Did you discover something in your work?
Yeah, so I've been a sort of a trademark researcher for a long time, and really originated in sort of cigarettes and tobacco products, where trademarks and trade dress were very much used to deceive consumers, where sort of the packaging shape, the color, the hue, the tint were used to shape a public health message. And from there, I had sort of explored trademarks as they were used to promote consumption across a lot of different sort of products, including food and beverage. And one of the product sectors I ran across was pharmaceuticals. And there the story is a little bit different, right? So in ways in which trademark and trade dress were used to promote the consumption of unhealthy products for tobacco and food and beverage, they're actually used to sort of promote consumption in pharmaceuticals as well. But for trade dress protection specifically, you can't have the attribute of the product or its appearance be functional, right? So that is the thing that pharmaceuticals were using. On the one hand, they would say, oh, it makes the product unique, nobody can copy it for purposes of trademark and trade dress protection. On the other hand, there was this very much functional aspect to what they were asserting, right? So people depend on the color of their meds and the shape of their meds. So a lot of you will be familiar with sort of Nexium, right? The purple pill. Most people are familiar with Viagra, which is a sort of a blue diamond shape. So it is used to promote consumption. And if that's true, then they shouldn't be able to continue to claim trademark and trade dress protection. But it was really just this progression of looking at additional products.
And was there something that surprised you about your research, or did you find what you expected?
I think what surprised me the most was that there was any controversy at all, that the appearance of medications was not functional, such that trade dress protection specifically shouldn't apply. So if you think about who consumes prescription drugs in this country, something along the lines of half of adults in the United States do use prescription drugs at some point during the year. As you reach the age of 80, that consumption becomes sort of, I'm speaking a little bit sort of like hyperbolically here, but it becomes basically universal. And sort of like most of us have sort of elderly relatives or friends, and sort of like they all have like 85 pills that they take. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody that those patients especially use product appearance, shape, size to identify which correct medicine to take. And given that sort of some of them are taken for heart disease, some of them are taken for seizures, it actually seems like we shouldn't allow that kind of protection given the people who consume prescription drugs and need them in this country.
So who would this article be most useful for? Is it the lawyers prosecuting the cases? Is it policymakers? And how would they go about using it?
Yeah, honestly, I think so it's written with three potentially change-oriented constituencies in mind, right? So one constituency is Congress. It's always difficult to get them to move on anything for sure. One constituency is the FDA, which I claim in the article, they already have statutory authority to sort of modify the way that they approve drugs. So FDA already enjoys wide authority to reject proposed sort of names and sort of appearance of drugs just based on the fact that it might result in medication error. And I argue in the article they could use that authority. But probably the most important, because it's easiest, would be judges, right? So there are there are sort of two important lines of cases, neither of which has been fully resolved by the Supreme Court. One out of the Second Circuit, claiming that sort of the pill appearance isn't sufficiently functional to destroy trade dress protection, and one out of the Third Circuit saying, look, everybody knows that sort of the appearance of these medicines is functional, such that you shouldn't be able to protect them through the Lanham Act, right, which is a trademark and trade dress protection statute. So in some ways, the article is written for the clerks of judges in all of the other circuits, that when this issue arises again, which it will, to say, look, it's clear that these are functional. It's clear that there shouldn't be trade dress protection or trademark protection for these medicines, especially after they go off patent. So it ends up being a pretty easy ruling, I think.
So what you're saying is there are two circuits that have a split, and then the rest of them haven't even addressed this issue?
Yeah, not at the appellate level that I've found. So there's certainly district courts, I think, in every current circuit that have addressed this issue either directly or peripherally, but I don't believe any of the other appellate courts have.
Okay. And Daniela, did you have some questions you'd like to ask?
Yeah, well, regarding some specific topics, can you tell us about the USPTO and the burden of proof of functionality?
Yeah, what would you like to know specifically? I mean, so you submit the trademark or trade dress application. It goes to a trademark reviewer. The reviewer will undertake the same search that the applicant should have already undertaken to make sure that there won't be any confusion with currently existing registered trademarks. There is also this review for these kind of statutory prohibitions like obscenity or the use of certain kinds of flags or symbols. But typically that search at the administrative level does not result in the rejection of a trademark based on a basic search. Most applicants have been savvy enough to undertake that search themselves. Now, whether or not a competitor agrees is a different matter, right? Sort of even if you receive the registration, a current trademark holder can challenge it, and that happens pretty routinely. But at the administrative level, that it's not a high bar. If that makes sense.
Okay. Thank you. And well, talking now about patents. Well, as you may know, the Biden administration announced that it supports the waiving intellectual property for protection for COVID-19 vaccines. So as the patent system is a multilateral one involving international treaties, it's really possible to speak of a release to its protection?
Well, so I think what I hear you saying is, will the COVID-19 patent waiver actually result in the expansion of the availability of vaccines? And that, the answer in my analysis is no, right? I mean, especially sort of for COVID-19 vaccines, there are a number of sort of technologies that are currently in use or authorized. But the ones that have resulted in, the ones that you've heard of, right? So the mRNA vaccine, which is Pfizer and Moderna, the adenovirus vaccines, which is sort of AstraZeneca and J&J. So patents are probably the least of the most difficult intellectual property barriers to making those, right? You need to know exactly sort of how to sort of make them, including industrial engineers, including sort of supply chains for the components that go into them. And they're sort of World Health Organization led efforts to try to put that kind of manufacturing capacity in South Africa and South America. And without the cooperation of, sort of Moderna or of Pfizer, which doesn't appear forthcoming, just not enforcing the patents won't be enough. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it's perfect. So in that sense, it will be possible for the World Trade Organization to force pharmaceutical companies that hold patents for vaccine to release their patents?
Yeah, so it's less. So the way the World Trade Organization works is they don't. Mm-hmm. The organization in Geneva itself doesn't actually enforce anything, right? They can authorize different countries to undertake retaliatory measures. But what the waiver does stand for is that sort of, let's say South Africa, which has otherwise agreed to all of the terms of the trade agreements, most importantly, sort of TRIPS, right, the intellectual property agreement, that they will not authorize sanctions against South Africa for not respecting the patents for the COVID-19 vaccines. If that makes sense. And the United States has, it has said that it supports that measure. I'm just saying it's an extraordinarily, like, so far as like from the point of, sort of making it to the point of it being in people's arms, you're not going to get very far from the making it point to the putting it in people's arms just through the TRIPS waiver.
Okay, so maybe do you think that a compulsory license are more effective mechanisms to achieve this momentary relief?
They could be, for sure. I mean, the United States government enjoys, current statutory authority to require the transfer of all of that technology, especially from Moderna, where the company worked very closely with scientists in the United States government, and where the government funded so much of the vaccine sort of that ultimately resulted. There has never been an administration that seemed inclined to use that authority. Similar authorities exist in Germany and in Australia, I believe. And I think for a number of reasons, governments just hesitate to use it. Whether or not they should is a really good question. This seems like a no-brainer, right? If there's ever going to be an emergency for which sort of compulsory licensing or compulsory transfer of technology makes sense, this seems to be it. So
it sounds like you're pretty unconvinced that either the patent solution or the compulsory license solution is viable. What would you suggest based on your work?
Oh no, by compulsory licensing, if you mean sort of, the facilitated transfer of know-how and technology to make the vaccines, for, essentially continental hubs, right? So WHO has identified, candidates in Argentina and Brazil. They've identified a couple of companies in South Africa, where essentially those are meant to be sort of continent-wide sort of manufacturers and distributors. Sure. I'm just, the way that we talk about compulsory licensing, the way that arose in the context of HIV/AIDS, especially, it was, I already know somebody who can manufacture the drug, right? It is literally just a matter of like me giving the legal authorization to that party to do it. And that did happen. And it's just not possible in the current, there is nobody out there who can manufacture the vaccines, even if you were to compel the patent holder to allow the information to be released. Does that make sense? Like, there's just so much more support. And maybe that's your question. That's sort of, there just needs to be an enormous kind of financial and scientific support effort undertaken. And, honestly, it should be by the United States, right? The United States should be sending sort of teams of scientists, and to some extent it is, and money to South Africa and to Argentina and to Brazil, and probably Indonesia and Turkey, to sort of help them become really significant manufacturers. There is some technical advising going on, right? There is an effort by the United States government to try to, at this point, I would say, convince Moderna to be more sort of free with the information than it is to date. But that's the solution.
So this conflict between health and pharmaceutical patent has been discussed for many years. For sure. Do you think that is really represent a contingency for public health that pharmaceutical patents exist?
Oh, that's a really good question. So my work in this area actually suggests, that pharmaceutical companies by and large are, they are links in a financial chain far more than they are innovators, right? So most of the research that results in breakthrough medicines is funded by the United States government to researchers that are typically in universities, right? The universities take that research to a very promising stage, at which point the big pharmaceutical companies essentially shop for candidates. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. It's fair enough. The big expense is the clinical trials, right? So we were talking about sort of at phase 3 enrolling, sort of 30,000, 40,000, 60,000 people, which is what, the COVID-19 vaccines have done. Like it is just not something that sort of universities can do at scale, but it actually is something that you can arrange and structure and finance, right, at the governmental level. So I've not believed for some time that pharmaceutical patents are what result in breakthrough medicines. I don't know that I've ever seriously thought about a world where they just don't exist at all. But you have examples of countries that became really successful over decades by not allowing patents on pharmaceuticals, like India and Brazil. It was sort of a little bit modified, and they essentially became really good at manufacturing medicines, and that seems like a good outcome. So I don't. Just because I haven't researched the question specifically, I don't know that I'm prepared to say, oh, there just shouldn't be. But I am willing to say that the way breakthrough medicines reach the market now, they are not justified to the extraordinary rents that the companies receive currently, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And if I could ask, what's next for your research, Professor? Were there any questions that you arose during this research that you'd like to dig into deeper?
Honestly, well, the questions that are most urgent as a result of this project, I think, are really identifying the cost of the trademark and trade dress protection. There are a handful of researchers, of which Aaron Kesselheim, is one of the most important, actually looking at this question. I don't think that number is more than 10 or 20, but that team of researchers have found real associations between trademark or trade dress protections and failure to abide by medication regimens. And actually, now that I think about it, it's a sort of a piece of the story that hasn't sort of been filled in this interview, is that sort of people go to their pharmacies and they order their prescription meds, right? And when they're generics, because of trademark or trade dress protections, they could look like anything, right? And maybe that wouldn't be so problematic if everybody went to a single pharmacy and it was always a reliable generic supplier at that pharmacy, so that it did, like, okay, I'm going from a green small pill to a larger white capsule. That one change, people can probably internalize that, but that isn't how it works, right? So generic pharmacies are switching up generic suppliers, once or twice a year, according to the research in the article. So at that point, people are seeing new colors, shapes of medicines frequently, and they get confused, or they just don't believe that it's the right one and they don't take it. But really, that empirical piece needs to be filled in more. There's enough there that I think these changes are justified anyway. But I think that's the most important step, next step in this sort of research trajectory. I don't know if I'll be the one to undertake that, but I think it is the most urgent. I mean, as you can probably tell from my responses to Danielle, I've been spending a lot of time with COVID vaccines, and that is where I will stay for a while.
All right. So you're concerned about the financial impact, but you're also concerned about discovering the empirical data of how this is affecting the way people take medicine. Is that right?
And what the harms are.
Right. All right. Daniela, did you have any other questions?
No, I think it's all really clear from my side. Yeah.
Terrific.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us, Professor Halabi.
Well,
it was great to talk to you. Can we find you? Can we find your work online on anywhere besides the JIPEL issue?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, if you just look at my, if the website at O'Neill will have a complete CV with a list of publications for sure. But my simple Google searches with whatever kind of IP product you're interested in will probably result in a pretty comprehensive list of what I've done.
All right. Well, thank you again, Professor Halabi. It was great talking to you today, and thanks for being here with the author series.
All right. Thanks so much. It was nice meeting you both.
Thank you very much. Bye.